This is called the intergroup contact hypothesis, which is simply put the idea that people become less racist, less discriminatory, more open-minded to each other when they just meet each other. And that a large amount of bigotry in the world is a consequence of having no contact with the people you're bigoted against. So there's a version of this idea that you say is wrong and a version that you say is right, or there's a crucial nuance. What is that nuance? I think it's very important.
Yeah, so this comes from a Harvard psychologist called Gordon Alpert, who during World War II was helping some group of refugees at a local charity. And he never quite says which group it is. He says, I had prejudices against these people. And when I started to work with them, and I realized that many of my prejudices were irrational, but actually very good people. And my fears I had about them were wrong-headed. And he said, hey, hang on a second. Is this something which can be generalized? Is it always the case, or often the case, once you have contact with a group that you have these negative opinions about, your views of them improve? And this was the beginning of probably the biggest research program in social psychology in the last 75 years, and thousands of studies. And they did mostly confirm this hunch. So one early influential study looked at housing projects in Boston, and there were some integrated ones and some segregated ones. And it turns out that when you had neighbors, if you're white and you had a neighbor who's black, you were more likely to have positive views of black people than if you were white and you lived in a segregated housing block and everybody around you was white and you never really had that kind of neighborly relation with somebody who's black. But there's also an important caveat which became clear through this research. And this is that there have to be particular conditions for that intergroup contact to work. So it doesn't work if I'm the boss and you're the employee. So we're never in a state of equality within the particular context in which we're interacting. That doesn't actually reduce conflict or prejudice in the same kind of way.
Right, because slaves and their masters had plenty of social contact, quote unquote, right?
Exactly. But they obviously did not have a context as equals. It's important that we share a goal. So, if I'm on a team of like Irish people, and we're playing every year against the Italians in the same league, that doesn't help. That might actually make things worse because we're like, our Irish team's got to beat the terrible Italian team. If you have mixity within the team and on the team is Irish and Italians, then that actually helps to go against prejudice because you're sharing this important goal together, right? And so we have all of this insight from really the richest, most detailed research program in psychology in 75 years about how to set up groups which encourage the overcoming of the prejudices. And it basically tells you to do the opposite of these affinity groups, right? Because what these affinity groups tell you is the most important thing is not that you're equal, it's that you're different. Some of you have these privileges over others, and so you should think of yourself as being in conflict. It encourages people to share stories of conflict and to share stories of how you don't get along. So in a systematic way, it does the opposite of what the research suggests works. And, what works is sort of boring. It's the sports team. It is sitting kids down and say, be respectful of each other, be aware of each other's differences, but actually you share a set of interests. It's to give them common tasks. There's a great pedagogical approach called the jigsaw puzzle approach, where every student has a piece of information, and it's only when all of them are part of solving this puzzle together that you can actually manage to do it. So it's contexts in which you're encouraging people who, outside of that context, may be unequal. Some may suffer more disadvantage than others. There may be conflict, but in that context, you're encouraging them to see each other as equals and to cooperate on a goal and to have shared interests. That's when you can actually fight against these kinds of prejudices.
All right. So I want to talk a little bit about diversity. This is, this is something I think people pay lip service to, but don't think deeply about. So basically, everyone except people on probably the far right will say the words, diversity is our greatest strength. But I'm not sure the behavior of the typical person actually matches that belief. So for example, has anyone ever gone to Abyssinian Church in Harlem, heard the choir, and thought, wow, this is an amazing environment, one of the best churches I've ever been to. Only problem with it is that there's no diversity. Everyone here is Black. It's like, no one's ever had that thought, I think. And there are many spaces like that where it's actually not clear that diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, would make this better. It's not clear it would make it worse either. It just seems irrelevant. It seems neutral. It seems orthogonal to everything that this space is about, which to me would suggest that diversity, racial diversity, is a contingent good. When it's good for reasons that have to do with specific consequences that have it makes, like I want the police force, I want the NYPD to be racially diverse, because when I imagine the NYPD being 100% white, but policing city in a crime where crime is 60 or 70% Black, the optics of that, the NYPD would be seen as having very little legitimacy. And it would make it tougher for them to do their jobs and tougher for them to keep all of us safe. So that's a way in which...
And it would probably make it easier for those officers to dehumanize Black people and other kinds of things, right? Yeah.
All sorts of things of that nature. And easier for Black people to mistrust the cops and all of it. So that's an area where it's clear to me that racial diversity is a good because of these other consequences. So how do you think about diversity as an inherent good?
Well, a couple of thoughts. One is that, one of the points I make is, look, I am exercised by a problem we have, which is that we have these deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies, but there's lots of people who are scared by that idea, who reject that idea. We have all kinds of practical problems that this clearly is giving rise to. And we got to make it work, because we know what historically the price of failure has been, right? If you somehow decided, as some people want, to make Germany or France less diverse now than it has become, what this means is the most extreme forms of violence and injustice, right? So there just isn't an alternative to making it work because of the way in which these societies have transformed over the last decades. Now, my book is not a book that's saying diverse democracies in general are better than others, right? Those societies that continue to be relatively homogeneous, Japan and Bulgaria or wherever else, they can legitimately make the sovereign decisions about what kind of society they want. Now, if they don't allow any kind of immigration that has some real disadvantages, both of those countries are depopulating, and that's an economic challenge. But you know what? If they prefer to depopulate rather than to let a lot of immigrants in and to become a more diverse democracy, that's perfectly fine, right? My book is not an argument at the level of Japan would be better if it was more diverse, right? So that's the first point. But the reason to work out how to deal with our deeply ethnically and religiously diverse democracies is that they are deeply ethnically and religiously diverse, and we want to sustain a democracy, and we want to treat people fairly, and we don't want to deteriorate into the worst forms of violence, not some abstract preference for diversity. The second thing I'll say is that I think there's different kinds of goods, right? There is something, I spent a little bit of time in Japan just before the pandemic, and there's something really interesting about a society that has such thick social norms, such a deeply shared culture, in part because it is quite homogeneous. If you had lots of immigration to Japan, some of the good things that come from those thick norms, from that shared culture, would undoubtedly go away. But I think other good things would also come from that. And certainly when I think of the cities I like the most and the countries I love the most, I do deeply appreciate the diversity they have. And now, as you're saying, it may not be that you need to have a white person in the choir in Harlem, But one of the things I love about New York City is that choir exists. But you can also go to a really Russian neighborhood in Brighton Beach, and you can also go to a really Latino neighborhood in East Harlem, and you can also go to a really Chinese neighborhood in Flushing. And I personally love that. Now, I don't think that's sort of objectively better or worse or whatever, but certainly when I think of the reasons that attracted me to the United States and many of the things I love about New York City, I love about other parts of America, its ability to sustain that kind of diversity is one of the things that appeals to me.
So one point you make in the book, which I think is really important to consider, is that democracy raises the stakes for intergroup conflict, and that in some ways that makes democracy more fragile when there's diversity than an autocratic state. Why is that?
Yeah. So look, if you're in a monarchy or in an empire, you don't have any power and I don't have any power, right? And so we both kind of have to trust the monarch. But that makes some things easier, because if you suddenly have more kids than I do, or there's more immigrants who come in who are part of your group rather than my group, it doesn't actually affect my political standing. There's no political standing to begin with. I had to have trust in the monarch, and there's no real reason why I should fear that the monarch is going to start treating me differently just because the relative size of our groups has changed. In a democracy, that's different. A democracy is always a search for majorities, right? And if I used to be in the majority, but suddenly demographic change means that your group is growing relative to mine, and perhaps you'll suddenly be in a majority, that gives me reason to be afraid. That gives me reason to say, hey, suddenly I'll be in the minority, and then I'm not going to be able to win the election, and the laws are going to change and perhaps going to be treated really badly. And you can see that mechanism at play in the politics of lots and lots of different countries, and you can see it being exploited by the far right in terms of their fears of the demographic transformation that the United States and other countries are going through.